Hello and welcome to Fintech Forward, a legal guide for busy fintech professionals, a podcast created and produced by K&L Gates. Each episode is designed to highlight emerging developments and cutting-edge advancements typically seen in the fintech space. We hope you enjoy our podcast.
Hi, this is Judie Rinearson. Welcome to another session of Fintech Forward. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to one of our newest partners, Hinkes from our Miami office. And Drew is one of the rock star lawyers of the crypto blockchain world. Before we get into our questions, Drew, could you share with us a little bit about how you got into the space in the first place, and what about the crypto blockchain world is the most interesting and attractive to you as someone who works in this space?
Well, thanks so much, Judie. It's great to join you here for this podcast. I became involved in the crypto and blockchain world in 2013, when a friend's younger brother actually was telling me about having a lot of financial success in buying and selling Bitcoin. And I had only known a little bit of what I might have heard from tech websites about Bitcoin. And my initial impression of the technology was that it was something that was used for criminal purposes or for those that couldn't otherwise access traditional means of payments. And I didn't think much of it. However, as my friend became increasingly more interested in it himself, and started sending me materials like the white paper and some other summaries of what Bitcoin was and how it worked, I became increasingly interested in learning more. I have a technical background as well as a legal background. So I started looking at the code and started thinking about the database architecture underlying Bitcoin. And it occurred to me from my exploration and learning that this was either going to be something that stayed in a relatively small corner of the internet to be used by people who believe in not allowing the government to understand what they do with their affairs, or it had a very small chance of really changing the way that we interact with each other, how people communicate, how people store and transact information, and it had a really significant chance of impacting the existing legacy financial world. And so within a few weeks of really starting to understand what Bitcoin was about, I realized that there was going to be a significant need for lawyers in this area that understood the technical issues. And I decided in early 2014 that I was going to try to be one of those folks. At the time, it was a little bit of a wild notion, but now it seems to be an area of great interest to a lot of folks. So for me, it's been quite an adventure and a ride. I think that folks using the technology in new and novel ways to realign relationships is really what's important and what's valuable about this technology. Simply using blockchains to press a new set of tokens and sell them with promises that you're going to make those tokens mean something in the future, to me, isn't terribly meaningful, even if it's an easy way to raise money.
Right.
What I think is interesting is people using technology to reorder relationships, realign incentives, to create systems and networks that have new incentives and that allow parties to realign who gets to control what sort of information in transactions. To me, that's where this technology gets very powerful. And those are the areas that I'm really interested in staying on top of.
Absolutely. And it's such a change. As you know, I'm a payments lawyer and I focus on this in the area of payments. And there's probably few areas more centralized than payments. Moving funds always requires a central bank, a central payment processor, someone who trusted intermediary who moves funds. And I think the amazing thing about blockchain and cryptocurrencies is that they just change everything. It really is fantastic. But do you think cryptocurrencies will actually replace current payment methods? Or do you think there will always be room for dollars and euros, and that this is going to just provide a parallel path for payments?
So most major world economies are operated by nation states, and they evolve, for better or for worse, more or less coalesced around the same basic model, which is there's a central bank that dictates through the control of supply and demand of a national fiat and its monetary policy. And then there are different alignments of commercial banks and wholesale banks and different alignments of digital types of means of payments and cash means of payments. And I've been a vocal advocate for cash and for maintaining paper money, because a future of only digital payments, especially those that seek to use blockchain technology in its various forms for payments, can be very promising or can devolve into a panopticon. We've started to see governments experimenting with central bank digital currencies, and there are a variety of different concepts underlying it, from things based on the Chicago Plan from the 1930s, which called for all U.S. persons to have an account at the Federal Reserve Bank and to cut out commercial banks altogether, to new and really experimental models such as the DCEP, which was released by the Chinese central bank, which allows the government to have unprecedented surveillance and control over its people and how they use their money. The DCEP can, at certain times, automatically impose and collect taxes on transactions. It can report back to the system operator where its users are, what kinds of transactions they're engaging in. And they've actually already tested something really neat, which is programmable money. The idea that you can receive value, have it for a certain period of time, and if you don't use it, you lose it. And the money is only spendable with certain pre-approved vendors. So these are all promising technologies. In the right hands, these technologies could be very meaningful and probably value accretive, but it also creates the very strong possibility that you could end up with a real substantial loss of privacy over your financial affairs, which, at least to a certain extent, is still protected by the Fourth Amendment, notwithstanding the third-party doctrine. These get into really, really big, both philosophical, jurisprudential issues. But suffice it to say, I want to live in a world where I still have cash as an option. And I want to live in a world where I have choices as to how I get to transact.
What you outlined about what China is experimenting with is really pretty scary. And as much as people complain about cash being dirty and shrinkage and all these and central bank controlled, it's an avenue for privacy that is just not in any other payment product. Certainly credit and debit cards, every transaction is also visible to some third party. That leads me back to you mentioned early on, some of the fears about cryptocurrencies and about how, there was a time, and it reminds me a little bit of the beginning of the internet, where everyone just said, oh, the internet's just for porn. Anyway, everyone said, oh, cryptocurrencies are just for money launderers and criminal enterprises. But one of the things that everyone points to is this use of cryptocurrencies as the payment of choice, especially Bitcoin, for ransomware. And first of all, if cryptocurrencies leave an electronic trail on the blockchain, why are these criminal enterprises still relying on something like Bitcoin or Ethereum for their ransom?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think early in the 2010s, there might have been the perception that Bitcoin and similar instruments are anonymous. And now we increasingly have a growing market of very sophisticated vendors that are able to correlate real-life identities to public network addresses. So the idea or the perception that these assets are anonymous at this point is kind of out the window. I think that there might be an argument, or perhaps some of these folks may be relying on matters of scale. There's only so many people to chase so many transactions. I think that there are some habits of those who have been unfortunately affected by ransomware, where perhaps they feel ashamed and they don't necessarily want to report it, or it might be nuisance value and they're not interested in necessarily reporting it. Our regulators in the United States have added some pressure by, in certain circumstances, indicating that it would be considered a violation of law to pay a ransom. And that has added some complexity to incident response for those folks. But your question was really, why does ransomware use these assets instead of how ransomware used to work, which is you would include a credit card number, or you would send a gift card, or you would be forced to make a purchase on a third-party website in order to unlock the machine. And the answer is, it's a damn good payment system, whether you're using it for something good or something not good. By no means am I endorsing the use of these assets to pay off ransomware. Obviously, I'm not endorsing ransomware. And although ransomware incidents can be very high profile and sometimes can affect very critical infrastructure, folks like Chainalysis, who are one of the many folks that do the forensics and the association of public network keys to identity for law enforcement investigations and private litigation and so forth, they estimate that less than 1% of transactions are actually related to ransomware. So 2 points from that are interesting. I think that the concerns might be somewhat overblown. And also, it's pretty interesting that this technology actually allows you to quantify that information, whereas you could never get that information for cash, and so you could never make a comparison.
Right, absolutely right. Changing gears a little bit, another complaint that I often hear about cryptocurrencies is all the energy that is used for mining. And you've seen these articles too, I'm sure, in 1 hour takes of crypto mining is more than all the electricity used in Los Angeles or something crazy like that. Do you think these are real concerns, and how do you think they should be addressed?
Well, we obviously are in an era where we are very sensitive to our energy consumption and the types of energy that we consume. And so it's natural that folks would look at one of Satoshi's most elegant decisions, which is how to create proof of work as a way of validating transactions and how to essentially use the ongoing arms race, try to find blocks as a way of securing the network. That's the good part. We've created a system that's very robust and it creates records that are very difficult to overwrite. The critics of Bitcoin say that this trade-off isn't worth it. Implicitly in that statement is the idea that there is maybe some level of energy expenditure that's worth maintaining Bitcoin for, or perhaps that Bitcoin just isn't worth spending all of this energy on. And that's a pretty normative statement. You could easily say that PlayStations and Xboxes and video games also don't really add a tremendous amount of value to society, and someone could probably work the numbers and see how much electricity is consumed by playing video games. And I've seen similar arguments about clothes dryers and Christmas lights and all sorts of other things that are highly energy consumptive and maybe, depending on who you ask, don't create a strong net benefit to society. I have seen the mining industry take this criticism very seriously. There are players that have come to market that have prioritized sourcing from green sources, using renewable energy, managing their carbon balance so that they are net zero, or they're attempting to offset their carbon consumption. And we've seen miners that are pursuing fallow or underutilized energy sources like pipeline off-gassing and certain other places where we aren't using our energy assets as efficiently as we can. And so I think that it's a valid criticism, and I think that the industry is taking really important steps, not just to respond to it, but to adapt to it, to drive efficiencies, to drive renewables, and ultimately that they're going to be able to help push the envelope with respect to a lot of energy efficiency.
I remember in Miami at the Bitcoin conference, there was one of the speakers touted the fact that his company only used renewable energy for mining. And he seemed to think that there ought to be a two-tier, like you could buy green Bitcoin or, black Bitcoin or something like that. And it created quite a stir because all of a sudden you're now talking about two classes of Bitcoin, which I don't think makes a lot of sense, but it's certainly a marketing ploy to have someone pay more for one kind of Bitcoin over the other.
Well, if you've been around Bitcoin long enough, you've heard about folks that are willing to pay a premium for Bitcoins that have not been through too many hands. And that's a reaction in certain instances to the perception that Bitcoin passing through certain addresses might pick up a taint based upon certain regulatory considerations, and that there might be some benefit or some value to getting Bitcoins that have a traceable lineage and haven't been mixed into other Bitcoins. But even those considerations suggest making Bitcoin less fungible. And if Bitcoin was to become less fungible, you would start to have problems with valuation. You'd start to have problems with the idea that you could use one Bitcoin of the same amount coextensively with another Bitcoin of the same amount. You might end up having to have Bitcoin grading services where certain Bitcoins that have less taint on them have a different value per unit than Bitcoins that hypothetically have more taint on them. And it would really make the system less useful and less elegant, less fast, and it would decrease the negotiability of Bitcoins. So I don't necessarily think that on an industry-wide basis, that sort of thing would be helpful, because I think it ultimately would reduce liquidity and negotiability of these assets in a way that wouldn't be helpful.
Yeah, And let's face it, when you get cash, you don't know where that cash has been or where it's been used. So I would agree that creates too much level of complexity in something that's already a very nice, elegant solution. Another issue that we lawyers love to talk about when we talk about cryptocurrencies is the securities laws. We all know that some regulators have basically said, hey, all cryptocurrencies are basically securities. I certainly don't agree on that, and I assume you have a viewpoint too. Do you think that there is a line that could be drawn of when a cryptocurrency crosses that line to become a security? And how would you describe that? I mean, we're still waiting, of course, for some clarity from our own regulators, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, what's interesting is the regulator that says all cryptocurrencies are securities is probably not to anyone's surprise, the securities regulator. But I don't think that it's necessarily something that should be viewed as a knock against the securities regulator. I think it's actually a keen observation and their take on the flexibility of this form. Digital assets in and of themselves have meaning within their systems, which means that within a given system, the code creates certain rules, and you can do with the asset within the context of the computer system whatever the code does or doesn't allow. When people create these assets and start to engage in transactions with others related to the assets, that's when external law can start to apply. And if you are offering these assets with certain promises, then you might be changing the legal significance of the transactions that you're entering into those that could be considered securities transactions. And because the form is so flexible, and because you have so much power to decide the meaning of the asset from the context in which it's offered and how it is used, it becomes increasingly difficult to draw the line between cryptocurrencies, currencies, commodities, and securities. So it's really not a surprise that the securities regulator views these assets in that way. Drawing lines and creating taxonomies in this industry is extraordinarily complex. Yep. Simply because technology does not drive the legal significance. And as a result, it becomes increasingly difficult to figure out exactly how every possible permutation of technology, stack, and representations into the market fits into a sort of legacy schema of these things are securities, these things are commodities, these things are goods that aren't really regulated in the same way.
Yeah. And I think it's that flexibility and that complexity which just makes it so hard. It makes it hard for regulators. And I think it also makes it hard for the industry to know what risks they're taking on. I do think we could use, as an industry, we could use a lot more clarity from our regulators. And I guess we think that's going to be happening relatively soon, but we'll see. Another side of the crypto world is banking. Why do you think so few banks are willing to get involved with cryptocurrency companies?
Well, I think there's a few narratives at play here. Banks are heavily regulated, and therefore they have significant obligations with respect to compliance. And as soon as you have significant compliance obligations, you're necessarily going to be more conservative. If you overstep your bounds or violate your policies, you're looking at potentially losing your franchise, so to speak. As long as banks require governments to tacitly or explicitly authorize them to engage in their profit-seeking activities, they're going to be mindful of staying in the good graces of their regulators.
Yeah.
And so then it becomes a matter of risk and reward. And as long as banks are conservative about the clients for whom they serve, and as long as de-risking is part of their compliance culture, it's going to be an uphill battle for banks to give crypto and the various legal entities and businesses that serve crypto the sort of warm embrace that many other industries have received, which is not to say, by the way, that there isn't a massive opportunity here, because the banks that have decided to embrace this industry have seen that they are able to make significant profit margins by providing depository accounts at very high fees, and some of those that have been experimenting with the technology have found that it can be used to eke out some pretty significant efficiencies within their own practices. I think it's helpful that we've seen new banks enter the space and be interested in working with cryptocurrency companies. Outside of the United States, there are many more options than are available within the United States, but the trend lines here are positive for the industry.
I do think part of it does come down to educating the regulators. I do think banks are, as you mentioned, have to be extraordinarily sensitive to what their regulators' views are in this space. Do you think that banks are going to really start offering directly cryptocurrency accounts and cryptocurrency transactions? And then the door has been open for that, but you don't really see a lot of that happening. At least I haven't seen it.
So it's hard to know when, but it seems like it's an inevitability that banks will eventually facilitate certain transactions involving crypto assets. We've already seen certain major U.S. banks get into the custody industry. I think U.S. Bank recently announced that it was going to start providing custodial services. Fidelity, for a while, has been providing custodial services. So I think the trend lines are all going in that direction. And I think that as Bitcoin and other assets like it become more institutionalized and start to blend and merge into the legacy financial industry more, we'll start to see more legacy players like banks engage on that sort of transactional level.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the signs are good for that. Changing course a little bit, can we talk about NFTs quickly? What are your thoughts about the NFT boom? Do you think it's going to continue, or is it a flash in the pan, as some say? What do you think?
So the NFT thing is fascinating to me. I'm very much intrigued by NFTs on a number of different levels. On one hand, it's a technology that's been around since 2013. So there's nothing by crypto standards that's super new about NFTs. But what we've really seen here is the embrace of the form by the creative community and its use in some novel ways. And so notwithstanding my misgivings about NFTs and all the legal issues I see about NFTs, how do you make sure that the license agreement flows through subsequent transferors? And how do you make sure that I don't want to get into it, but there's a host of IP issues involved in NFTs. Notwithstanding my concerns, the explosion has really been dramatic. And I think that we're starting to see increasing creativity in the way that NFTs are being used to signify other rights and other powers and other assets, and being used as a way of signifying membership in affinity groups. I heard somebody refer to their apes NFTs as closest that they're going to come to a country club. And so I think that, once again, the NFT is by itself a technical instrument. It's a specific kind of blockchain asset that can be traced from its creation all the way to its current holder. But what you do with that and the creative ways that people are using it are what fascinates me. I do think that NFTs will ultimately be used in financial transactions in ways that is actually more efficient and effective than fungible assets that are currently being used. And I think that there's a lot of a run for those assets in that context coming in the future.
Yeah, I have to admit that the role of NFTs for being able to monetize art and film and music, it does provide an exciting opportunity, but it's just got to be done right.
Absolutely. And I think that it's also pushing us to think about, from a lawyer and from a legal academic perspective, it's forcing us to go back and think about how we own things and what ownership means and what control of a digital asset means, and how we can use the varying different ways of owning things and sharing ownership of assets in new and novel ways, or whether we simply are going to be repeating some of the evolutionary mistakes that were made along the way to get to the same place that we are now with tangible assets. But it cracks open all kinds of really fascinating property issues as well.
Yep. Very good. And now, can we just talk briefly about DeFi before we close? We have, I guess, a lot of questions about DeFi. And when you look it up or try to read about it, the descriptions are always very vague. And no wonder people who are outside of the, tight crypto community look at DeFi and, scratch their head and say, well, what is that all about? So I think DeFi is very important. It's a really important piece of the whole blockchain digital asset puzzle. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you think it's important and what is it all about anyway.
Right. So I was initially a little bit skeptical of DeFi when it first came out, until I really took the time to understand it. There are a bunch of different ways to think about DeFi, but one good place to start if you want to kind of try to understand what it's all about is a really nice article written by Fabian Schar that was actually published by the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. And it essentially lays out what decentralized finance is. His explanation of matters tends to hew a little bit close to specific architectures and certain products, which I try to stay away from. But when my students ask me what DeFi is, I essentially say, as Bitcoin is to peer-to-peer payments, DeFi is to a variety of more complex financial arrangements and transactions. You have building blocks that we inherited from Bitcoin, which is the ability to have decentralized transactions that use different weird intermediaries instead of intermediaries that can exercise censorship over your transaction. And then we build on top of that smart contracts, which is a way of embedding instructions to a computer that when an event occurs calls for a transaction of assets from one wallet to another wallet. And with these primitives, you can build together a series of technology platforms where software is acting in a way that is taking part in a transaction in a way that is traditionally done by a legally addressable entity. And so using these primitives and building them together, folks have been able to create software that facilitates transactions that normally happen between parties, but where instead you have a legal entity that is interacting with a set of codes. We have decentralized exchange protocols. Actually, the model kind of came from a prior project called Bancor, but it's been used in a whole bunch of other very successful exchange protocols like Curve and Balancer and Uniswap and 0x. And this creates new ways to trade digital assets that do not require an intermediary. You have MakerDAO, which very famously has created a web of smart contracts that essentially offer collateralized debt transactions or leverage retail commodities transactions, depending on how you want to think about it. You've got interest rate swap protocols or interest rate protocols, which essentially allow for over-collateralized lending and over-collateralized borrowing. And so what you get with DeFi are new technology stacks that enable somewhat familiar-looking financial transactions to be entered into without the sort of counterparties or intermediaries that exist in the traditional finance world. And the reason that this is so powerful is the censorship resistance, the lack of gating, in certain cases, the lack of AML KYC, which may or may not persist long term, the transparency, because everything happens on a blockchain, all the information is available and open to the world. The fact that the code is out there for the tiny sliver of humanity that can actually read code suggests that there's more transparency there. And all these systems are designed on the same set of common software rails, which means that they are interoperable and they can be aligned in certain ways so that assets created by one and transactions facilitated by the others can then be wrapped into increasingly complex additional transactions. The industry calls that composability. So what you have here is an area where parties are able to engage in very interesting and useful transactions, and it's absolutely exploding. We may or may not see that growth continue as the inevitable regulation starts to impose its will on the industry, but it's a huge growth area and one that we're, obviously at the firm excited to help folks to navigate.
Good. Yeah, it is. It's incredibly powerful. And thank you for that excellent description of how it works for our audience. So, final question of the day. What do you see as the biggest threats to the cryptocurrency industry today?
So here we are ending the 12th year of the cryptocurrency experiment. And at this point, it would be pretty obvious for anybody who's watching whether crypto assets are going in one of two directions. It either is poised to be an enemy of the traditional financial world and is in opposition to everything that occurs in the legacy financial world and thus would be just annihilated by regulators. On the other hand, the other path is that it starts to integrate in meaningful ways into the legacy financial world. And that is, you have people from the legacy world that see the merit and value to the systems and products created by crypto. And then the push and pull is how to integrate these new assets into the legacy financial world. And very clearly, we've headed into that second path, the integration path. We have seen from the regulatory agencies, governments, and multi-governmental organizations that there is a variety of different approaches being suggested as to regulating transactions involving these assets. I believe that our regulators are capable of coming out with common sense, useful regulation that can accomplish policy aims like protecting consumers without rendering these assets totally unusable. But this has gone from something that was on the sidelines for eccentrics, something that is now being quickly embraced by the investing class and being used by younger generations extensively. So there's going to be a lot of push-pull with respect to how these assets are regulated. There have been certain regulatory enactments suggested, like the infrastructure bill and the midnight rulemaking that we saw just before the change in presidential administration at the end of 2020, which gave me some very significant pause and would create some very material challenges to the industry. But in both instances, we did see the industry mobilize in a meaningful way to start to sort of flex its muscle. We've seen certain companies emerge as leaders. We've seen advocacy organizations emerge in order to take positive positions and try to advance dialogues with regulators and policymakers. And so I'm encouraged that while bad regulation might be the biggest threat, that the industry is taking proactive steps to try to educate and encourage the spread of good policy.
Well, I think I agree with you 100%. The burgeoning future regulation of these products, it could actually, completely undermine where this industry is going. And the last thing the industry needs to do is to sit on the sidelines and wait and see what happens. They've got to have their voices heard, not only on Capitol Hill, but in Europe, in Asia, and within the states that are also starting to regulate. So there's a massive amount of education that's going to have to be done, but I think the industry is up to it. So thank you. And I really enjoyed our session, and I hope we have a chance to talk again in the future. Take care.
Thanks so much, Judie.
Thanks again for listening to Fintech Forward, a legal guide for fintech professionals. New episodes are available for download through iTunes, Google Play, and other podcast applications. By subscribing to Fintech Forward, you will receive timely notifications of each new episode. Also, if you have any topics that you would like to hear discussed, please email fintechforwardsupport@kalegates.com. We would love to hear from you.